All across America, people are losing their jobs, being banned from Facebook and Twitter, their videos demonetized, and their reputation dragged through the mud, all for sharing an opinion, or in certain cases, a fact. Let me explain. As I make this video, I'm overcome with fear and anxiety. This is not a fun subject to talk about. I have lost sleep over this subject. Our entertainment nowadays has become so badly politicized that most every movie and most every book, every video game has to have at least some feminist or some social justice-y element. Otherwise, the creators are called racists, sexists, and transphobes. And I even fear sometimes, and this is why I'm losing sleep, is that I could be next. That when I get my first book published, and if I get a second printing where I'm able to have, more than 500 or even a few thousand, there would be the outrage machine in full force. They would want to see me fired, kicked off of Twitter, DeviantArt, all of them for being a supposed racist, sexist, and transphobe. Even though I'm not any of those things. I know that, and my roommate knows that. And what will he say when I'm banned from Facebook and we can't message each other anymore? What will he say when he is called a racist for being associated with me? And there was one university up in Illinois that has the day of absence, or had the day of absence before the pandemic, in which case only students of color are invited there. But white people aren't allowed there. Just so we can have a conversation about, racism, oppression, and all that other communist filth and garbage. And there was a professor who rightfully protested this, this is horribly racist and discriminatory. He got a mob of people. He got banned from Facebook, Twitter, got fired from his job, just for posting an opinion or for saying an opinion. And he isn't the only one either. Like a lot of YouTube personalities like Sinatra Says, Sargon of Akkad, what was that guy who does Magic the Gathering? It's on the tip of my tongue. The Quartering! They have all been banned from one sphere or another, be it Twitter or Magic the Gathering tournaments. They've all been banned for saying an opinion or, in certain cases, just fact. Like just saying a fact, or like posting national crime statistics showing black people killing and doing violent crime more than any other race. And bear in mind, this is not drug-related offenses either. This isn't the non-violent stuff. We're talking about rapes, burglaries, armed robbery, that kind of stuff. They seem to be more likely to be committing that, hence why the police profile them so much. But even just to point out this fact, in certain instances, can get you yeeted from Twitter, from Patreon, from any possible sphere of public life. Your reputation is dragged through the mud. No one wants to hire a racist, or a sexist, or a transphobe, or whatever. And most people who are facing the brunt of this weren't even alive in the Jim Crow era, where people of color were tangibly, legitimately oppressed. The thing is, we're living in 2020, not 1960. I'm talking to you over YouTube, not CB radio. Certain things move on, and time progresses. And yes, Jim Crow and slavery were all very ugly points of history, but they're just that. History. That's in the past. Things move on. Like we have had people of color go to space. We've had them in sports arenas, in politics, in professors, as voice actors, pretty much every possible walk of life that has any semblance of prestige has been achieved by Black Americans in one form or another. Even before political correctness, you had heavy hitters like Will Smith, Dave Chappelle, and all the rest of those guys who were famous, un-PC, and unapologetic about it. They wanted to live their lives and excel. And even if they do remember the oppression, they leave the oppression long behind. Those scars heal, and when they have children, they grow up in a world that doesn't have Jim Crow. and the only racists that leftists like to talk about only exist in isolated pockets. Not to say they don't exist, but just that they are contained to a few online edgelords. These people aren't racist white supremacists. They're just reasonable people who want to play video games, have their own careers, and just live their lives without hurting anyone. And unfortunately, we're living in an age where even words can get them sacked. And so everyone's kind of walking on eggshells a little bit. I do not want to see my home state devolve into chaos. But it's getting to a point where we can't really talk about these issues because if we do, we're bigots. And if we retaliate in any way, we're bigots. So no matter what happens, so long as it's not supporting the ideology, we're bigots. When they're some of the most prominent bigots out there, they just use loaded terms like racist and sexist to hide it better. And who is really against women? Who is against the rights of women, they'll say. And who is against the rights of black people? Racists, that's who. And A equals B, therefore you are a racist. Now, how did this madness even become a thing in the first place? Because it sure as hell wasn't always like this. Well, it all started in 2003, when social media as we know it today was in its infancy and sites like Friendster and MySpace were barely gaining public prominence. And universities were teaching critical theory and intersectionality to seniors who were barely going to be graduating that year. Presumably because they had to take at least one philosophy class, they got in and were basically told to critique all of society. Now, critical theory is basically the idea of looking at the world through the eyes of a critic, like a movie critic, like what a movie critic does to a movie. It could be a whole assortment of things, anything ranging from the English language all the way on up to systems of government. Every part of society can and should be criticized, which at the root is not a bad idea in principle. And the idea of intersectionality, which is, let's say, less noble than they'd like you to think. Intersectionality is basically the things and categories that make up you, things like your hobbies, your race, your gender, your age in certain cases. So all the different categories and components that make up you and your personality. And that certain kinds of oppressions can intersect with each other. So in the framework of intersectionality, a black woman is more oppressed, is doubly oppressed as opposed to a black man or a white woman, because she doesn't just face sexism from the supposed patriarchy, she also faces racism from the white supremacy, or the supposed white supremacy. In case you haven't figured it out yet, intersectionality is basically a cross between socialism, feminism, and social justice, and all the nasty things that happen in between. So, with their new knowledge of, frankly, complete and total garbage, they were finally able to go out into the workplace, especially into the fields of business and IT, and entertainment too. And perhaps under Bush, this left-leaning ideology would have seemed much more measured and controlled during an age of meaningless wars, crusades, and a Great Recession, the housing bubble, and people barely being able to pay their bills. Now, when the recession happened, something very interesting became into focus, where it was clearly apparent that Bush was more concerned about things happening halfway around the world than things happening within 4 blocks of the White House. And it didn't matter whether you were left-wing or right-wing, pro-war or anti-war, environmentalist or oil driller, it just wasn't a good look. And naturally, there was backlash. That at that time, the evangelical Christians were still in power and were trying to censor the internet, and thus left-wing opposition was natural and totally understood during this time. Like, it was the right-wingers of 2007, 2008 that would delete YouTube videos or get people's videos deleted, and it was a fairly long-standing drama between the young Earth creationists and literally everyone else. And so, this framework of environmentalism and intersectionality seemed totally level-headed, during a time of complete and total chaos. And it was from this era that we got our first black president, Barack Obama. But as changes were happening in the White House, changes were happening in the video store too. That not only was DVD king, the movies that were on the DVDs were beginning to suck. And movies like Bridge to Terabitha and Shorts should have been. Anyway, movies like Bridge to Terabitha, Shorts, Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland all seem to rely more on age-old cliches and franchises than having actual writing talent. Hell, even video games were going through a shift during this time, as they were transitioning out of platformers, racing games, and shooters to comprehensive, open-world, task-based experiences. And now, the first time in human history, video games could be taken seriously as a medium of artistic expression, and thus there was a huge push in the industry to make it more cinematic, bigger and better, complete with foul language, swearing, all to combat that pesky little inferiority complex. And game developers could have the same approval, or could garner the same approval as movie directors were able to for the past several decades. Video games were now accepted, mainstream, and above all else, popular. And even music all began to sound the same, with pop artists like Justin Bieber and Adele sounding more identical to each other by the year. And as for the new crop of SJWs, they were by and large ignored by society, because they didn't have the power needed to influence it or to cancel people the way they can now. And they were mainly treated as kind of an eclectic bunch of weirdos. I mean, yeah, I had to sit through a few seminars about the environment and multiculturalism that were very SJW-esque, but by and large, they were kind of free to do what they will, especially in my home state, where they used us as a political laboratory. They had their own platforms, everyone else had their own platforms, and people more or less kept to themselves, or some. And in all this time, they were still teaching people intersectionality and critical race theory, even when it wasn't popular or even widely supported. And as for the new crop of SJWs, they were by and large ignored by society, because they didn't have the power needed to influence it or to cancel people the way they can now. And they were mainly treated as kind of an eclectic bunch of weirdos. I mean, yeah, I had to sit through a few seminars about the environment and multiculturalism that were very SJW-esque, but by and large, they were kind of free to do what they will, especially in my home state, where they used us as a political laboratory. They had their own platforms, everyone else had their own platforms, and people more or less kept to themselves. Something was happening, but most people couldn't put their finger on just what exactly it was. That wasn't until around 2012, 2013, some activists somewhere claimed to be, oppressed by mere words and what's the word? Microaggression. And they claimed that even just saying, where are you from, when it's a space where people come from all over the world and all over the country. And people claim that to be racist and a revealing telling of stereotypes, or at least the pre-stereotypical bias in their heads. And after they hit the mainstream with this nonsense, they soon put it in their movies, in their video games, and they've made it front and center of every possible entertainment that you can consume. Like, it's at a point where I can't even watch cartoons without seeing Trump caricatures or overall references to the Russian meddling, which is a conspiracy theory that is just as unproven as the QAnon people. And they started pulling shit like, well, you hate this movie because it has a female lead in it, you're sexist, or this movie had black people in it and you hate it, therefore you hate black people. When the reality is that no, I don't hate them because they're women or blacks or whatever. I hate this movie because it's badly written and the plot makes very little sense in context to the story. This is why movies suck now. It's because they're way more focused on politics than actually telling a decent story. Like, I shouldn't have to question my values when I read a comic book, for instance. And yet, the progressive dipshits in entertainment are having me do that. And a lot of these people have very little experience, and we see them being interviewed for things like Thundercats Roar or The Daughter of Starfire, and they actively say that they hated the original stuff because it represented like toxic masculinity or that it was too cool for them. Yes, there really was someone who said that the old version was too cool for them. And the Quartering does a lot of really great videos on it where he goes into their qualifications, he looks into them, and it turns out that a good portion of them have very little experience writing or doing anything creative. They might have a degree in gender studies, and they might have worked here or worked there, but they're ultimately talentless hacks. They don't know how to string a good plot together. It's just like, ooh, strong independent women. They'll love it. But it's like, when you're boiling things down to archetypes like the toxic white man, the strong independent woman, the Mary Sue, the Gary Sue if it's a black guy, or a native or someone who's historically oppressed, and then from there on, the characters not only become flat, but they almost become like game pieces, like when you're playing a game of chess, and they just change out the background and just move the pieces. And the Nostalgia Critic said it best, where making a movie, because he reviews movies, is like The Wizard of Oz, where you don't want to see the man behind the curtain. Oh, it was like political messages in movies, where you don't want to see the man behind the curtain. You just want to experience the story. And when I'm constantly being bombarded by reality in my fiction, I am seeing the man behind the curtain. Or is it the woman? Or is it the demi-boy? That stuff's too confusing anyways. And you can only sustain chess pieces for so long before it gets boring. Like, even in an actual game of chess, like, there's things that the chess masters do besides chess. And likewise, when they're telling the same stories over and over and over again, it gets very boring. It is the very reason why movies suck now, why TV sucks now. It's because of this far-left ideology that's put propaganda in our video games and everything like that. And all these people who say that I'm a bigot aren't looking in the mirror because it's like they're selling a broken product. Like in the case of Assassin's Creed Unity, like there was broken collision, Mary Sue characters, character models that don't render properly, that had to have a patch on day one. It's like you're selling people a broken product. I don't care if there's a female assassin, although the tokenism doesn't help either. I just want to play the game. If I wanted to see reality, I would just walk right out of this house and go walking down the tracks. Or if I wanted to see politics, I'd watch C-SPAN, not Steven Universe. And having political intrigue is fine maybe for like a spy flick or a biographical, historical, whatever. But in children's cartoons, really? Where children will eat up that information, not understand the points that they're even making, and just parrot them when they're older without knowing why. And it's at that point where everything needs to support this heavily left-leaning agenda. And those who are against the program are these horrible rednecky bigots. When I've met actual rednecks, and believe it or not, they're not these racist fucks with southern drawls and high levels of technological incompetence. I have relatives who live in Oregon, and bear in mind this is not like Portland or Eugene. This is in a little town called Scappoose. It's about a 30-minute drive out of Portland in the Oregon Panhandle by the Columbia River. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, my great-uncle Joe has this tree farm, and he grows these redwood trees, has them cut down and made into furniture. And he is not privileged by any means. He would have even been voting age during the days of Jim Crow. But he's not privileged. He's not exactly poor, but he's not rich either. Like, he had to sell off a large portion of his land just so he could be able to retire. And he passed what was left on to his children. And I found all this out on New Year's Eve 2017, or yeah, it was 2017. And I know that they're not bigots because when BTS performed before the ball dropped, I didn't hear any, well, where's the American artists? I had them ask, oh, where are they? They asked, oh, where are they from? And I said, oh, they're Korean. Huh, interesting. And that was the end of it. If they really, or if they weren't bigoted towards me or towards my mother or whoever, who knows who else, my mom would be complaining about them. And trust me, my mother is not the kind of person to be shy about complaining about like family drama, problem coworkers, and things like that. When she has a falling out with my grandmother, she lets me know, sometimes when I don't even ask. And it's not just Oregon either. You might say, oh, Oregon's a blue state. They might have been more exposed to, the virtues of acceptance and tolerance. Well, you'll be pleasantly surprised when I tell you that I went to Wisconsin. Yes, Wisconsin, that borders Canada to the south and Chicago to the north. And my mom was single. I was born to a single mother, and she was trying online dating. And one of the first guys that she had was a dairy farmer who lived in Wisconsin. And this was a very remote part of Wisconsin, mind you. I want to say it's like a 45-minute drive out of the state capital of Madison. And so this is the middle of nowhere. He was deaf and hard of hearing, and it squeaked me out because I was like 10 years old at the time. And he wasn't bigoted or sexist, and if he was, my mom would have complained about it to me when she broke up with him, but that's beside the point. I've seen this country. I've been to Virginia, Virginia, the District of Columbia, Texas, Iowa, Oregon, Nevada, and pretty much every conceivable point of California that you can think of. And in all my travels, I have only seen people who want to live their lives. These people aren't evil. They're not demons. They're just down-home, regular folks who are into anime, religion, whatever. And they want to live the best lives that they can. And living the best lives that they can is being kind to people, even if they have a different skin color to them. And all these idiots that my roommate sees on Facebook are basically the useful idiots of the right. They don't represent the wider scope of this country at all. As much as they claim to, they would actually despise folks like me. Like, they would call guys like me cuck-servative, just to give you an idea of the phenomenon that I'm kind of talking about. And all these alt-right QAnon dipshits, what do they have really? A few churches, problem president, a few internet edgelords, a few radio edgelords, and that's about it. And all these asshats who are saying, go make me a sandwich, or fuck darkies, or niggers, or whatever. Those people are either trolls or the few minority of white supremacists that do exist in this country. Not like they don't exist, but that they're in a very small minority and in very isolated pockets. Granted, there's more of them now than there were, say, 15 years ago. But, that's like saying there's more cassettes now than there were 15 years ago. They have no real power in 2020. Now, the stereotype of the technologically illiterate hillbilly has been with us for well over 100 years at this point, and is based around misconceptions around the poor and how they can't afford all the nicest electronics in the world, and how people in rural areas tend to have a lesser education than people from the cities. And so there is this image that suddenly emerges, an image of someone who is stupid but well-meaning? Well, once the social justice lunatics started taking over entertainment, they went from being stupid and kind-hearted to being stupid and downright evil, even outright demonic in certain cases, where they are the ones holding us back and holding people back. And now, all these kind Southern hospitality people are not only told that they're stupid, now they're told that they're everything wrong with the world and humanity, that they're intolerant, and that they're, in a sense, subhuman, when the reality is that it couldn't be any further from the truth. Some of our most prominent civil rights activists have come out of Alabama. Hell, they've even led us in the world of science. North Carolina is actually leading this country in the field of stem cell research, and I know this because I have an uncle who works in Raleigh. He's gay for the first part, so you have a gay guy in apparently racist, homophobic North Carolina, which is in the deep south. And then you have what he's doing there. He's working on stem cell research. Granted, it's from plants, not like embryos, but it's there. North Carolina really is leading in the field of stem cell research. Wikipedia was founded out of Alabama, as was the Saturn rocket launches. And a lot of satellites and probes are still launched out of Huntsville, Alabama to this very day. So, if all these people were so backwards and fundamentalist and retrograde, why are there all these scientific advancements coming out of there? This opinion seems to be centered around a certain kind of bigotry. A bigotry of what could best be described as non-Californians. And what is a non-Californian, you may ask? Well, it's someone who doesn't think like a Californian, talk like a Californian, or act like a Californian. Like when you go to certain places like San Jose, Santa Cruz, or Los Angeles, you get this unwritten urge to be on your best behavior. You get this unwritten urge to not make all the jokes that you want, however offensive they may or may not be. And there's also a very good amount of double standards where women can talk about toxic masculinity, but I can't talk about toxic femininity that their lipstick gives them. So apparently one's fine and another isn't. Again, we see a little bit of this with the intersectional social justice business, wherein a Native American guy can dress up as a medieval knight, but a white guy can't dress up as a Cherokee warrior. So how is one thing okay, but not another? I don't care if it's because of history, because guess what? I don't know if you've noticed this, but I wasn't alive then. My grandfather wasn't alive then. Why should I have to suffer for things I didn't even do? And even if you look back in my ancestral lineages, they probably wouldn't have even known about the Indian Wars. Because they would have come to this country long after that had ended. And I don't see it reasonable to punish me for something I didn't even do or say. Look, no matter how anyone slices this, this is fundamentally a double standard. I am ultimately suffering for something I didn't even do, all because of the color of my skin. And it's such a displeasure to see that in the state of California, it is now legal to racially profile people, especially in academia. Like, affirmative action is back in California with a vengeance. It was outlawed in 1996 for very good reason, and now it's back. And that means that black people are now being held to a lower standard. Blacks, Hispanics, natives are now being held to a lower standard than whites, just because the end results are not the same. As if all humans aren't just clones of each other, that they all have different interests and so forth. Nope, force people to do things they don't like. And on a side note, because Asians test well, they have to be tested to a higher standard than whites. Let that sink in. Asians are being tested to a higher standard than white people, just because they expect Asians to be smarter. So it's okay when they have all these stereotypes, but not when I have stereotypes. It's okay for them to depict Russians as these demonic spy people, like complete with scowls that would rival any Cold War propaganda poster. But yet, when I even entertain the possibility of stereotypical Hispanic or black people, suddenly I'm the racist, I'm the bigot, and my concerns are suddenly invalid just because what I've said offended no one except the sensibilities of those in power. My concerns of having my book banned in my own state, or possibly even being arrested were things to really go downhill, is invalid. And they're rendered invalid because history. I do apologize for ranting and raving about this for so long, but it's just a lot of things that I wanted to get off my chest. Things that I have had to live with, that I have had to lay awake through countless nights through, that have put hampers on my reading and my writing and everything that I enjoy. And you're probably thinking, what in the world could have possibly spurred this on? Well, a while back, me and my roommate have discussions, as it were. Now, bear in mind that my roommate has a very tragic backstory, as it were. Grew up to an abusive mother, a completely toxic family. He was beaten and bashed around by folks who wanted him to be just as miserable and neurotic as they were. His upbringing was like playing a game of Among Us, where everyone is imposter. And that said, he has a very funny way of seeing the world. Like, he thinks that every other person is just as toxic as members of his own family. For instance, he's under the impression, like a lot of people on the left, that a large portion of this country, like geographically speaking, or at least outside of Santa Cruz County, which is where we live, are holding America back and keeping society very retrograde, racist, sexist, and all that jazz. When I'm driving with him and he's casually bad-mouthing Americans and loathing the country that he's in, he's letting his trauma and popular media rule over what he's doing. And bear in mind, this is a pretty smart dude. He doesn't really watch the news that much, and he's not. I can actually hear him microwaving his food right now. Anyways, he means very well, but he's been woefully misguided to think that everyone outside of this bubble is out to get him, or more accurately, is out to get the good people who live here, and that they're all evil, and that they're all holding us back. When, as I've established, that couldn't be further from the truth. Hell, I partly made this video just for his sake, because I do not have the guts to talk about this with him, because again, all this fear and anxiety that's built up in me. What if we get into an argument and we cease being friends? Or what if he retaliates physically in certain instances? Or what if he doesn't even hear me out because, he has ADHD as well? And so he might pick out one part of that, and we have had a pretty heated discussion around the time of the election where he went into how he was bullied in high school and basically conflated that to employers refusing him a job because he supposedly didn't have a wide enough sounding name, when the reality is, as far as he knows, they could have accepted someone with an even more complicated, difficult name than him. And there's just so many different variables. So unless they're telling you directly, you don't really know these things. And he's just kind of lived in paranoia because, like I said, he grew up in a very broken household, and thus that's what he's more accustomed to, as tragic and horrible as it is. But yet, because he's been fed all this stuff about white people, and because he's been picked on by, his subordinates for not being like more Chicano Latino and being like Gringo Latino when he was in high school, he's still come to the conclusion that white people are evil, or that basically most of Americans are evil, when, as I've established already, most Americans aren't evil. They're not good, but they're not bad either. And because he's been fed all this stuff, presumably from his girlfriend and from popular media like, games and movies and so forth, he's been indoctrinated in a way he doesn't realize. And when he talks with that intensity, or even when, as one time during that discussion that I mentioned earlier, where he was conflating, or he was like, where he was like conflating the bullies who treated him poorly in high school and employers, he completely misunderstood, what I would have said. I don't know if it's intentionally, and I hate drawing those kinds of conclusions. But basically, he said something like, "How would you know that example when I already told you? I don't want to hear you anymore." And he put his hand out like this. And all we could do was go our separate ways after that. And after that, he treated me really patronizingly. And I kind of told him, I feel miserable at this, but I don't know why. And he said, "Well, it's because you're wrong and you don't know how to deal with it." And it's patronizing, ironically racist shit like this, which is why his talks make me uncomfortable. It's because he's a bigot without completely realizing. And I know how clickbaity that sounds, but after you've heard my description of my roommate, would you say he's bigoted too? Like, imagine if it was the opposite, and I was the Hispanic guy, and he was telling me, "I don't want to hear your words anymore." He would look very racist and bigoted, won't he? But because I am not Hispanic, suddenly I'm the racist. I'm the bigot. I'm the evil guy. I mean, he knows that I'm not a good. He knows that, like, he knows that, I am not, racist, because I've, explained to him, what my views and opinions are, and that, I am against abortion and most of that other far right stuff. And he's, by and large, accepted me. Like, when the election happened, I was scared to tell him that I voted Trump. And I was not happy about voting Trump either. I just wanted this country to be free, and I want to be able to publish my books without getting taxed so harshly that I might as well just be getting Social Security earnings, since the profits would be barely any more than my Social Security. And he's just kind of brushed this off as it being propaganda. And I'm really, really sorry if I am ranting, but this is kind of how I feel. And I kind of felt like I had to make this, because he notices this weird tension, and I notice this weird tension. Like, we get along in pretty much every other way. Like, we love watching cartoons together, we love playing games together, we love going on walks together, but when the subject of politics comes up, this tension comes up. This highly politicized tension about the institutionalized bigotry that happened, when he isn't fully aware, and I don't think he really wants to be aware, since all he knows is how to deal with abuse. And when the world isn't as abusive and there aren't as many definite bad guys as he's been led to believe growing up, then he is kind of forced to adopt this very, pardon the metaphor, cartoonishly narrow sense of the world. And so I'm just kind of looking forward to just how relieved I'm going to feel once I finally share him this very video, and once I've finally gotten all these different grievances off my chest, just so our relationship can go on as normal and I can keep helping him with his life problems. Anyway, this is Tim Onstad, over and out.